Limoux, April 2007. Marianne, my darling granddaughter, I've been wondering if I should write this letter, if I should send it to you. I might leave it to chance, maybe you'll find it after I'm dead, or maybe it'll get thrown out without anyone ever reading it. I started writing this letter, then abandoned it for a couple of weeks. But today I've picked it up again with the firm intention of finishing it. I owe it to myself to write it, because I've never been honest about what happened back in Spain over 70 years ago. All these things I've often thought about but never discussed with anyone, not even with your grandfather or your mother, and certainly not with the few friends I made since coming to this country. I know now I won't be sending it to you, but that doesn't mean you'll never read it. Just like all the women in my family, I'm a bit of a witch, bruja. I know you'll find it eventually rummaging through a pile of my belongings after I'm gone. Knowing all that, knowing you'll never read this letter while I'm alive, gives me the courage to tell you the real story of the life I had before I got married and had children. Now I'm not sure where to start, so many memories rushing back in one go. I'm almost out of breath. I'm going to start with something light. It's something we share, this need for lightness. That and some genes which make you look so much like me at your age, except I was much darker. But your father is a blue-eyed, white-skinned Francais from the north. Man was a real man of the Pyrenees. Skin like leather, facial features that could cut through stone, dark eyes and raven hair. My mother was just as dark. Look at the wedding photograph if you don't believe me. Why am I going into so much detail? When you don't know the first thing about your Spanish family, your family from Catalonia and Aragon. Your mother certainly didn't want to hear about it. She hated everything to do with Spain. I can't fully blame her. Spain was living in another century to France and the rest of Europe until the late 1970s, until that old bastard, Franco, died. I know she never told you the little she learned over the years, almost against her will. How strange that you should be more interested in your roots than she was, that you should look like me when she's the spitting image of your grandfather. The main thing you and I don't have in common is the kind of life offered to us. You're lucky. Thank God for that. I can almost hear you reading this letter out loud, imitating my accent. I'm glad you decided to learn Spanish. Your mother never bothered trying. I can almost hear you read this letter in an exaggerated Spanish accent, and it puts a smile on my face. French people have done it to mock me, and it's upset me more than I ever allowed them to realize. You don't know much about me, not even my real name. To you, I'm Mamie or Maria, the name under which I came to be known in France. But my real name was not Maria, it was Nieves. You understand it means snows, but when I was naturalized after 10 years in France, the registrar had no clue what it meant. He even had the nerve to tell me it didn't sound very Christian. Me who had to flee ultra-Catholic Spain, having to listen to that. I didn't make a fuss and we went for Maria. Strange, isn't it, that my own granddaughter doesn't even know my name? At least you know I'm Catalan. Well, you know I was Catalan, because in 1939 I became stateless, stripped of my Spanish citizenship by El Caudillo. So I guess I was nothing after that, no longer Spanish and no longer Catalan, because when he became the ruler of Spain, Francisco Franco made sure the people of Catalonia didn't dare to identify as Catalan anymore, and I never became French either, even though I was French on paper. Your grandfather, may he rest in peace, was happy about this new identity. Although Spanish himself, he had come to France long before the war for work. Of course, he was still Spanish at heart. He died Spanish at heart, and he hated Franco just as much as I did. He had fought under the command of the then Colonel Franco in the Rif War in Morocco. Whether this is true or not, whether he witnessed it with his own eyes or heard it from another soldier, he would always tell the story of this poor Moroccan sod who was supposedly fighting by the Spaniards' side until they found out he was spying for the Berbers. Franco ordered him to dig his own grave, where he was buried alive. Maybe this was just a story your grandfather told to brag about having personally witnessed Franco's sadistic side, the one he also showed between 1936 and 1939. So yes, your grandfather hated Franco, but maybe he hated the communists even more. To him, all the refugees who came to France in 1939 at the time of La Retirada, the retreat, all of them without exception, were Reds or anarchists. And I was one of them, even though he'd persuaded himself I was too young at the time to understand what was going on and deserved a second chance. He urged me to forget the past, change my name to Maria, and forget I was once Nieves, the Catalan Republican fighter. I was a Catalan who didn't speak Catalan. Where I come from, the Val d'Aran, people spoke Spanish and Aranese, which is quite similar to Occitan, the southern French language. And when I first set foot in the south of France, being able to understand Occitan was helpful for me, who didn't speak French. I remember in 1968 when that song came out, L'Estaca. Franco was still in power, the old bastard refused to die. Catalonia and its traditions and culture were being ignored. Still, there were a few clandestine radio stations, and in some places in the French Pyrenees, by the border with Catalonia, you could pick up some of them. That summer of 1968, we were on holiday in Collioure, your grandfather and I, and it was then that I first heard that song, L'Estaca. Of course, it was in Catalan, and I'd never learned the language, but I remembered some words from my years in Barcelona during the war, and between French, Spanish, and Aranese, I could make up what the lyrics meant. L'Estaca, the stake to which we all tied up. And if you pull a bit this way, and if I pull a bit that way, for sure he will fall, and we'll be free.
Visisec te'n parlava da bon matí al portal mentre el sol esperàvem i els carros veiem passar Sisset que no veus l'estaca a on estem tots lligats si no podem desvendre
I was just 10 years old when King Alfonso XIII was overthrown and the Spanish Republic declared for the second time in our history. Did it change anything for the people of Tremp, my hometown in the province of Lerida? Did men suddenly realize that women were their equals, that the priests who had told them that women's brains were not quite on a par with theirs had been wrong all along? There aren't many landmarks in Tremp. Just a church that looks like a citadel, as if the Moors were coming to invade Spain all over again. That's the church where I was baptized, where I first received communion and was confirmed, where I would have got married if things had been different and had followed the path that was always supposed to be mine. When I say I grew up in Tremp, it's a bit of an exaggeration. My parents had a tiny farm outside of town, a little stone house on a hill that didn't even have real windows, surrounded by olive and almond trees and cold all year round. Thankfully, there was a river running just past the house, which meant we didn't have to carry the water buckets very far. Need I say there was no running water in the house? Going to school was a pain, particularly in winter, but I'm not going to bore you with that. That's not why I'm writing to you. It looks an awful lot like Aragon in that part of Catalonia, mountains and canyons, and not a lot that can grow on this land. Since Franco died, I hear it's become quite a touristic place. I wouldn't know. I never went back. I could have gone back after the amnesty law of 1977, but some of us decided not to, maybe because this was no longer the country we'd known, maybe because we'd become something else, something that shouldn't have existed, people who didn't belong anywhere. Of course, the issue with the amnesty law was that it exonerated everybody of crimes committed during the Civil War. As Republicans, we'd had to pay the price for our crimes already, the summary execution, and worst of all, the slow agony of exile. But the nationalists had led a comfortable life after Franco's victory, and many, both in Spain and elsewhere, wanted these people to be trialed for crimes against humanity, but it never happened. Most of them are dead by now anyway. In 1936, I was 15, and just like in France, the Popular Front, this alliance of left parties, had won the general election. But socialism didn't last very long in Spain. In July, there was a coup that split the armed forces between nationalists and republicans. Franco, by then General Franco, led the troops from Morocco to attack the mainland, while another general in Navarra, in the Pyrenees, led the troops down to the south of the country. I'm not going to inflict a history lesson on you. The German Luftwaffe's Condé Legion, bombing us from all corners, the defeat at El Ebro, and Barcelona and Madrid falling in early 1939, triggering La Retirada, about 500,000 people walking across the Pyrenees to reach France. France had remained neutral during the Civil War, for fear of something similar happening on its soil, but France was the last hope of all these people, my last hope too. If you want to explore this period from a more human perspective, you've got plenty to investigate. In the 70 years since it happened, a lot of art has focused on La Guerra Civil. Go and see Picasso's Guernica, the Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid. Read Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, watch Ken Loach's Land and Freedom. Read Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Toll, or the recent Almudena Grandes' El Corazón Helado, Spain's Dr. Zhivago I've read somewhere, and I couldn't help laughing, because this is how most people want to learn about revolutions, through a good old romantic story. Guernica is the perfect symbol for the Civil War, a country devastated in an instant, just like that little town in the Basque Country was. As for Orwell, he describes these factions, large or small, to which I belonged, and unlike Ken Loach, who told pretty much the same story in his film, he did it in a totally unromantic way. This is how I remember it all. Very unromantic. So if you're expecting some big secret about a lover left behind and never forgot, you can stop reading this letter right now. There was no lover, just some friends I was close to. Nothing more. We didn't have time for romantic stuff, believe me. When you're cold, sick from malnutrition, and scared every hour of the day, there's no time to fall in love. I'm sure it happened to some people, just not to me. What these books and these films don't fully convey is the feeling of the invisible enemy, an enemy speaking the same language, looking just like you, culturally similar, an enemy who lived next door to you. All these books and films cannot possibly convey the fact that you couldn't trust anyone anymore. Had a constant suspicion played on our minds, destroying all beliefs we'd previously held. How we had to create our own set of beliefs. I'm not talking about the fascists here. They had their beliefs and they held on to them. And here we are, autumn 1936 in Tremp. My father had opened our house to the Republicans who had turned it into their HQ. We lived far away from the town and no one suspected anything for a while. The Republicans were organizing with others from the next valley in Aragon. Orwell talks about Aragon in homage to Catalonia. Your grandfather, who never actually read the book, derived some pride from it because he mentions his hometown, Barbastro. The Republicans, hiding in our house, still took their orders from Barcelona at that stage. My father had never been political, but he never liked the priests either, or the people who supported them, the rich people who would let us go hungry. One of his cousins had been arrested and thrown in jail for a week, just for having spoken Aranese, and even if he wasn't a Catalan nationalist, my father wanted his culture to be recognized and he supported the Republicans. My mother claimed she didn't have to take sides. She was just a woman. What could she possibly know? My father had made her swear not to mention that Republicans were hiding in our house to anyone in town, but she had made no such promise when it came to talking to the priest in confession. One morning, my father woke me up as the stars were still shining in the sky and told me to get dressed and follow him. I just had the time to pull my day dress on top of the night dress, put some shoes on, and off we went with the 5 Republican soldiers who were staying at our house. Of course, knows where. My father didn't know and nor did I, and we didn't ask. I remember that walk in the dark, followed by many hours of hiking through the mountains. We stopped for the night at the house of people friendly to the Republican cause. I never saw my mother again or my siblings who were very young at the time. My father decided to stay with me and fight with the Republicans. Why he'd chosen me to come with him rather than my 10-year-old brother, I'll never know. I believe it's because he hoped my brother would be more helpful to my mother than I would now that he'd left, that he would become the man of the house. I don't know. I never heard from any of them ever again. That priest, one of the soldiers would often say, he'll get what's coming to him. Aragon and Catalonia were under Republican control and remained so until 1938 and the Battle of Teruel. But even though the Republicans controlled both regions, it didn't prevent denunciations and people being summarily shot by the nationalists. So from Huesca, which we reached after 5 days of walking through the mountains, we took a train to Barcelona, where the adventure started. I didn't take part in the many battles that were fought. Some other girls, older than me and generally more aware of life than I was, fought on the front line, but I didn't. I tried to use a rifle during the Barcelona May days of 1937, but I never really fought. I helped as best I could, though. I learned how to care for the wounded. I helped people die as peacefully as possible. I cooked for thousands. I sewed uniforms. I cleaned. And above all, I learned. I read anything I could lay my hands on, mostly communist and anarchist literature, everything from the POUM pamphlets to Das Kapital, from the writings of Lenin to those of Proudhon and Bakunin. At the time when I reached Barcelona with my father, the POUM, El Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, The Workers' Party of Marxist unification had become particularly popular with all those who didn't want Stalin and the USSR to tell us what to do. Of course, the USSR and Mexico were the only countries supporting us, the former sending us weapons. Not fast enough, that's what I kept hearing. But it didn't give them power over us. I wasn't like these girls in the Republican Army you might have seen pictures of. I wasn't liberated. In fact, I was still a virgin on my wedding night. Shocking, isn't it? So yes, whenever I had a moment to myself at the hospital, I would read away from the mourning of the injured soldiers, away from the stench of the infected wounds. And eventually my mind started to open from the political materials. I quickly moved on to regular literature. Me, who had never been brilliant at school, how could I be when I had to take care of the goats and my siblings most of the time? I started writing a journal where I would note my daily observations. I lost the diary in 1937 during the Barcelona May days when the communists decided we of the POUM were the enemy because instead of focusing on the war against Franco's nationalists, we wanted a revolution. We no longer wanted to defend the Republic, they claimed. It wasn't exactly true. We wanted both the Republic and the revolution, but that was not to be. I saw it all behind the shutters, the fighting on the streets, the barricades, the people falling, brothers fighting brothers yet again. 6 days of unnecessary violence. This is where my father died, on the streets. I cried for him, of course I cried. But there wasn't much time to grieve, so I did that much later, in France. That's when I allowed myself to mourn my father. The leaders of the POUM were arrested and the party outlawed shortly after the end of the conflict. I continued doing my job as a nurse. There were more battles against the fascists, this time Teruel, Aragon, and then the defeat at El Ebro.
Que me tiré en el puente y también la pasarela, me verás pasar el Ebro en un barquito de vela, me verás pasar el Ebro.
the end of the Republic in December 38, Franco launched a battle against Catalonia. I was lucky, I guess. I could have died in that battle, which saw Franco's troops take over Barcelona on the 26th of January 1939, but been evacuated to Girona and from there to Figueres, first by train and then by truck. By the time I reached Figueres, however, there were no more means of transport and walking was all we had left. Walking to the French border, that was our only hope. A continuous flow of people walking in silence through the villages and on the beaches until eventually we reached France. We weren't welcomed with open arms. France had its own problems, the impending war with Germany most of all. Taking on 500,000 people was not something they wanted or had prepared for, despite the many warnings and pleas from what was left of the Republican government. Well, they'd prepared for 10,000-20,000 people. This was a bit of a shock. At first, only the civilians were allowed through. As a woman, that was easy for me. Eventually, even what was left of the Republican army were allowed to enter France, escaping the ruthless Phalangist repression. The people I found myself interned with on that beach in Argelès-sur-Mer were desperately looking for their family, lost during the battles or the long walk of La Retirada. I had no one left, as though my mother and siblings had never existed. The camp brought about a painful awakening from the dream we'd all had. That dream we didn't want to give up on, even after the defeat at El Ebro. The fall of Barcelona was the beginning of the end, and then came the purgatory of La Retirada, the long walk to the French border, and then came the camp, the antechamber of hell. That was it. Franco and the fascists had won, and Spain would never be the same again. At least that's what we thought back then. On that beach in Argelès-sur-Mer, there was nothing, the sand, the wind and the sea. No buildings to shield us from the cold wind, just huts built with straw and driftwood. Nowhere to wash, and so diseases started to develop and spread fast, thanks to the fleas and lice. Whenever food was distributed, it led to stampedes. Some people, including me, had stopped bothering. But there would always be someone, a kind soul, to give me a bit of what they'd managed to scavenge. And so I had a little to eat once in a while, and he was one of these kind-hearted people who would eventually transform my life. I could have ended up returning to Spain after all. Who would have known if I'd been in the Republican army? I could have ended up spending months in the hell on earth that was Argelès-sur-Mer. And I could have been sent to another of the camps that were starting to open up all over France, somewhere in the north, where I would have felt even more in exile. But then this old man offered to share the bread and lentil soup he'd been given by the Red Cross, in exchange for which I agreed to pose as his daughter and take care of him until we were allowed out of the camp. Because he was very old and clearly not a dangerous anarchist, he was transferred to another camp away from the sea in a village called Bram. As his daughter, I was allowed to accompany him, and I made myself indispensable. When I explained I had some medical training, nothing academic, but definitely a lot of first-hand experience. Bram was an amazingly beautiful village built in a circle around a fortress church, which reminded me of the church of my hometown. There was something powerful in that place, something I liked from the very first moment. Of course, we weren't allowed to wander the streets of Bram immediately. We had no papers, no identity. Even those who had managed to keep some proof of identity would soon be stripped of their Spanish citizenship. There were a lot of people who needed to become legal again, and the office of the High Commissioner for Refugees in London delivered countless stateless passports. After thorough interviews and checks, of course, just in case dangerous people had managed to get through, when France had opened its borders. The old man had coached me to provide the right answers for the interview, after which I'd be given a stateless passport. His son lived here in France, not far from Bram. He had come to France in the 1920s in search of work. The old man had offered to come and live with them after we were released from the camp. I passed and was handed my stateless passport and told I could apply for naturalization in 10 years if I was a good girl. It was a huge relief to be out of the camp and know there was a place for me here, with Spanish people who would help me acclimatize to this new life. It didn't occur to me I had other options, Mexico or Chile or somewhere else in Latin America. It didn't occur to me that France was on the verge of war. All that mattered to me was that I had a roof over my head and no more people dying around me. You may have already gathered that the old man's son was your grandfather, Dominique. His real name was Domingo, but he changed it upon becoming a French citizen. I cannot complain. The life we had was good, nothing extraordinary, but good. We were married in church, something I wouldn't have normally strongly opposed because I'd become wary of the church during the Civil War. But I didn't dare to voice my concerns because I felt I owed it to the old man, who was deeply religious. In the same way, I didn't want my children to be baptized, but yielded to Domingo and his father's will. I guess that eventually I became a good Spanish wife. Domingo was a hard-working builder. Eventually, he started his own business. I worked as a cleaner, of course. What else could a Spanish woman do? After I had a mother and uncle and Domingo started making more money, I'm talking mid to late 1950s here, I enrolled in some evening and distance learning classes. In the end, I started teaching Spanish in secondary school. I'm not sure if your grandfather was proud of me or ashamed, his wife having diplomas when he didn't, but he never stopped me from becoming a teacher, and I'm grateful for it. But he always knew I was different when it kept a low profile during the Second World War. I'd help people on their way to Spain and from there to London. Ironic, isn't it, when I never went back to Spain? Towards the end of the war, in October 1944, there was a failed attempt to establish a provisional republican government in my native region of the Val d'Aran, a military operation that united all the people who'd been unable to unite before, socialists, communists, republicans and anarchists. When I learned about it, long after the events, it made me glad I was no longer involved in politics. Waste of time. Your grandfather went back to Aragon after the amnesty law of 1977. He could have gone earlier, but in memory of his father, who'd been pro-Republican, he felt he couldn't set foot on Spanish soil for as long as Franco was alive. He rekindled the relationship with what was left of his family there, and many cousins came over the years to visit. You've met some of them despite your mother's best efforts to keep you away from them. He encouraged me to go back, but my mother was long gone by now. And as for my siblings, the oldest was just 10 years old when I left. What was I going to tell him and the others, 2 girls and another boy, that I'd wiped their arses when they were babies? So instead, I've decided to write to you, Marianne, my beautiful granddaughter, so you know who I was, what I fought for. I've seen you grow into an independent, intelligent woman, and your interest in my original culture makes me feel so proud. I hope you enjoyed reading this letter. I hope it gave you an idea of who your grandmother was. My life was neither better nor worse than that of many others who lived through those troubled times. In fact, I've had a good life, considering. But I wanted you to know the real me. At least someone should.